In 1453, when the Great Walls of Constantinople finally collapsed, the greatest fear in that moment was not death. Death, after all, was familiar to medieval war. It was expected, even welcomed, as a form of release. The true terror was survival, because for many, survival did not mean rescue or freedom. It meant a life deliberately engineered to be worse than death itself. For Christian nuns, the Ottoman conquest was not merely a political catastrophe or a military defeat. It became a carefully calculated spiritual punishment, so extreme in its implications that the Vatican itself quietly approved a response that would remain secret for centuries. To understand that fear, one must imagine the moment not as a grand historical event, but as an intimate invasion. Picture the silk garments of the conqueror brushing against your skin. Not armor, not iron, soft fabric, expensive, refined. The same hands that ordered your convent burned to the ground now dictate every movement of your body, every hour of your day. The women who had renounced the world, who had rejected marriage, desire, lineage, inheritance, and even personal identity, were forced back into the world in its most distorted and humiliating form. They were pushed not into ordinary slavery, but into the darkest and most decadent corner of imperial power, the Sultan's harem. More than 200 convents vanished from the historical record in the decades following the fall. They were not destroyed in dramatic flames recorded by chroniclers, nor wiped out in heroic last stands. Instead, they disappeared into silence. A silence so complete that it unsettles historians even today. When the gates of Constantinople fell, the Byzantine world shattered in every direction, politically, theologically, culturally. But the consequences were not evenly distributed. Some populations were killed outright, some were enslaved, and some, particularly religious women, were condemned to a fate that medieval conquest had never before systematically implemented. This was not simply the capture of a city. It was the collision of two absolute worldviews, one defined by vows, renunciation, and spiritual purity, the other built on lineage, reproduction, and imperial continuity. The Ottoman army understood how to process soldiers. It knew how to handle priests. These were familiar categories within conquest. But the nun posed a problem without precedent. What should be done with a woman who had sworn lifelong celibacy? A woman who had rejected the very institutions, marriage, motherhood, inheritance, that sustained the social and political logic of the new ruling power? In this sense, the nun became more than a captive. She became a contradiction, a living challenge to authority. Her existence alone undermined the assumptions of conquest, and it was precisely this contradiction that transformed her spiritual devotion into a target. What had once been her highest protection, her vow, became the reason for her destruction. This was not bodily torture in the traditional sense. It was the calculated desecration of the soul. The choice placed before these women was not simply between life and death, but between existence and the total annihilation of spiritual identity. For a nun, the body was not merely flesh. It was the vessel of a sacred promise. Capture meant that this promise was instantly placed in mortal danger. Historical records, carefully sanitized over centuries, reveal not chaos or accidental cruelty, but a deliberate system. A system designed not to punish individuals, but to invalidate faith itself. At the convent of Sister Theodora, hundreds of women gathered in final prayer as the sound of Ottoman drums echoed through the narrow streets. This was not the kind of martyrdom that history finds easy to record. There was no swift execution, no clean ending. Instead, there was waiting, a slow, methodical erosion of certainty, a psychological campaign designed to demonstrate that their God had abandoned them, that their vows had been meaningless, and that resistance would not be rewarded with honor. The Ottoman Empire is often remembered for its administrative tolerance. The dhimmi system, the jizya tax, the protected status of Christians and Jews. These policies did exist, and for many peasants and merchants, they offered a form of survival. But this narrative collapses when applied to religious women. Monks could be executed, ransomed, or forced into labor. Their value was measurable. Nuns were different. They did not fit into economic logic, and because they did not fit, they could not be ignored. From this contradiction emerged three distinct outcomes, shaped largely by geography. The first, and psychologically most devastating, awaited those captured during major sieges. Educated nuns or women from influential families were transported directly to the heart of imperial authority. Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. Venetian diplomatic records describe what followed in chilling detail. These women entered the harem and effectively vanished from history. There were no ransom demands, no correspondence, no appeals. Yet the harem itself was not simply a space of indulgence. It was a highly structured institution, governed by hierarchy, discipline, and bureaucracy. And within that structure, the nuns were assigned a role that was deliberately cruel in its subtlety. They were not immediately designated as concubines. Instead, they were forced into intimate service roles, attending to the women who shared the sultan's bed, preparing clothing, cleaning chambers, handling linens, standing silently at the edge of private spaces they had once vowed never to acknowledge. Their bodies might remain untouched, but their spirits were subjected to daily humiliation. Imagine being Sister Theodora. Each day, you dress the woman who will sleep with the man who ordered your convent destroyed. Each night, you remove the evidence of intimacy from the room. You are not violated directly, but you are forced to facilitate violation. This was not an assault on flesh. It was an assault on faith itself. In 1526, Venetian envoy Piero Brigadon recorded that these women were not kept for pleasure, but for demonstration. They were living exhibits, proof that vows could be broken without force, that faith could be rendered powerless without bloodshed. One former abbess was compelled to teach Italian to the Sultan's favorite concubine. During the day, grammar lessons. At night, the concubine practiced the language by recounting her intimate encounters, while the abbess corrected her pronunciation. In moments like these, death no longer appeared tragic. It appeared merciful. Beyond the imperial center, the provinces offered a different but equally terrifying fate. Here, oversight was weaker and brutality more direct. Nuns were presented with three choices: convert to Islam, pay crushing taxes, or die. Yet a fourth path emerged, one born of desperation rather than policy. Public conversion combined with secret Christianity. By day, they were Fatima. By night, Sister Maria. Their true names were whispered only in darkness. A small wooden cross, hidden beneath clothing or floorboards, became more valuable than life itself. Discovery did not bring swift execution. It brought prolonged suffering, designed to serve as warning. In 1537, Sister Maria was captured for precisely this crime. Later survivors testified that they spoke Greek but thought in Turkish. Their prayers remained Christian, but fear had restructured their minds. Faith endured, but the soul fractured under constant vigilance. Even the church offered little refuge. In 1542, it was decreed that nuns who had converted, even under undeniable duress, could not be readmitted to convent life. Survival came at the cost of belonging. The most terrifying fate of all left no narrative behind. Between 1450 and 1550, more than 200 convents appear in Ottoman tax registers. Buildings listed, land measured. Under population, a single word appears: Sabia, captives. Population: 0. There are no refugee lists, no martyrdom chronicles, only absence. Modern genetic studies confirm what records do not say aloud. This silence was not disappearance, but absorption. A systematic process of forced integration. A letter written in 1492 by Sister Helena confirms this reality. Younger nuns were separated immediately. They were forced into motherhood to ensure permanent enslavement. Their sons were absorbed into military systems, their daughters into administrative ones. The system reproduced itself through their bodies. It was this theological crisis that pushed the Vatican to an unthinkable conclusion. Where capture meant spiritual annihilation, self-inflicted death was permitted. This is why convents burned during sieges. These were not accidents. They were final acts of resistance. Sister Helena wrote, "We did not go willingly. We were taken. What was done to us was done to thousands. Remember us." Centuries later, we return their names to the light. Because the true cost of history is not always paid by the defeated on the battlefield. More often, it is paid in silence, by women whose lives, identities, and faith were erased without record.